Oh, alright. Hey there, Pirate Monkey Crew, and welcome to another tutorial today. We are jumping into advanced non-metallic metal. So, one of the things that I want to talk about with advanced non-metallic metal, just to start off here at first, is I want to talk about something that I like to refer to as additive shape. And really what that means is that the more reflective an object becomes, the more it's going to take on the shape of the light source, instead of the other way around, which is what we usually have been talking about, which is shape language. And this is something that happens, for instance, you can see it with chromatic objects. If you look at a flat chromatic object, you can see the spherical sun if it's outside. And that's just really something that we have to take into account here. So in this case, we're going to be painting a somewhat flat-ish sword that's a little bit more reflective. And so really all we're doing is we're kind of adding flat plus spherical equals kind of a little bit of a curvy, like a square, and if you just curved out the sides of that square. So nothing too complex. It's just kind of one of those extra things to think about as you are starting to paint your non-metallic metal object. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and jump in here with this sword, of course. Really all we're going to be doing here is the normal non-metallic metal workup. I'm starting with a neutral gray. I've been finding that that's my favorite place to start with non-metallic metal, and really because what it lets me do is it lets me work up to like my brighter tones, and from there I can really see if I'm starting to get a bunch of really great contrast. And so what I'm doing here is it's probably just a little bit of like a thin down white, maybe a white and gray mixture, maybe 75% white, 25% gray, and we're just kind of thinning it down a little bit, adding the layer, and we're just putting more of that just right on top of itself, because the first one is going to be a little bit transparent. And as you can see there too, it has kind of like an oval-ish shape. The ends are a little bit pointy right now, and that's okay. They're going to get kind of curved out as we move along in this process. But you can see that my highlight shape is a little bit more curved than it normally would be. And that's because what I'm taking into account is the shape of the light source and adding that into this kind of flatter sword shape. And so this is probably like a 50-50 mix of the gray and the white, and it's a little bit more thinned down. And really I'm just trying to expand that area just a little bit. Something that I find more and more, as I do studies of, like steel or, more silver colored metals, is that the value spectrum tends to be much higher than I usually initially think it should be, especially like with miniatures. Normally with miniatures it seems like it's maybe like a 50-50, with highlights, midtone, or highlights, midtones, shadows, it's all kind of evenly split up. But the more I take a look at it, the more I find that like my highlights and my midtones are probably composing 2/3, maybe a little bit more of the total surface of the metallic object. And when you're painting, a scale miniature, it's not quite as important because it's so small and needs to have exaggerated contrast. But if you start working in a little bit larger scale, especially the 54 and the 75 mil, you really have to take it into account, just because it makes the metallics look much more realistic. So, and even here, I mean, this is one of the miniatures from the Blackstone Fortress, so it's like 32 mil plus ish with the Beastmen, and this technique worked out really well. Something as well that I'm doing here with my blending is it doesn't necessarily fall into any of the techniques that we talk about on a regular basis. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to mix the right value, and then I'm kind of stitching between a couple of colors. And we can glaze and we can refine it a little bit more later on, and I definitely do that. But the stitching between the two colors, especially at a little bit of a thinner consistency, really helps build those transitions. And like we talked about a lot of times with shape language, as long as the shape and the pattern of the highlight is accurate and we have some kind of a transition, the eye thinks that it looks metallic, and we're already starting to get that effect. And something else to consider too is when you look at small metallic objects, especially, and I would highly recommend that you start taking pictures of things just like spoons or the top of your salt shaker, you can really zoom in and you can really see the way that those transitions are built. And you'll find that they're not always perfectly smooth. They can be a little bit more abrupt. Sometimes, if you hyper zoom in, you can see the full transition. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. So now I've started to build in some more of my shadow tones. And, you'll see here that I don't do much of it on the top part of it. But I'll, I'm feathering here just a touch. But on the bottom side, I will get it a little bit further. One thing that I would suggest too, if you're trying to get an even more realistic looking NMM, is that you don't have to go to pure black. It's just not always necessary. The smaller the miniature is, the more necessary it can become, just because you need the contrast to be that much more explosive. And you can see, that paint looked a little bit blackish as I was applying it. That's really just the, when it's wet and a little bit more, has a higher sheen to it, it looks darker than it actually is. It's just really dark gray. So then just kind of coming back and just trying to blend out just a little bit more. I'm not going to hyper focus on this. I think real-time painting, altogether it took 15-20 minutes to get this painted. So it doesn't take very long once you start to grasp and have a good understanding of it, and you have a good understanding of the way that like the shapes and the patterns and what all of that is demanding from you. So just throwing some white back in there, just really reestablishing some things. I did some glazes of, I think it might have been either a close to black color or a black color, just to kind of even things out. And it always helps to just come back with your brightest color. One of the ways that you can really trick an eye is just by creating a ton of transparent layers. And after a while, it just starts to look and feel smooth. Okay, and so what we're starting to do here is I'm starting to glaze a little bit of a cool yellow. Cool yellow is naturally the brightest color that comes after white. And really what's, and you can zoom in, like I was talking about before, zoom in on those images of metallic objects, whether they're outside or just in the house, anything like that. And what you can see is that there is actually a little bit of like a spectrum shift that happens in the same way that it happens when light passes through a prism. And the same thing happens with metallic objects to some extent when the light is reflected back to you. Normally though, unless you're looking really, really closely and usually through some kind of camera, it's really hard to see, but it's still a pattern that the eye responds very, very well to. Especially if, like in this character's instance, the character's outside. It's very obvious because the light source is somewhat warm. So it's just something to consider. And even more added information onto this is that when the light splits, generally, if it's a warm light source, it's going to shift, cool yellow, warm yellow, orange, and then red, and then it won't shift into magenta. And then very, very rarely will it shift, to the blue-green side of things. But if it does, it's just going to go cool yellow, green, and then into a very, very light blue spectrum. With all that out of the way, what we're doing here now is we are starting to glaze in cool yellow. And again, it's a little bit of a weird instance because, again, cool yellow is the brightest yellow. And, we have to put it there just because in terms of the sequence of colors after white, that's the next brightest one. And so after that, of course, we're going to do this warm yellow. We really only do one glaze of it. It's very, it's very, very light, just because we don't want to overwhelm this with color. And we're actually going to work back over this even a little bit later just to reinstill some of the grays. After the warm yellow, what we do is we glaze on a little bit of an orange, and then, after this immediately, we're just going to do just the faintest, tiniest little hint of red. And in this case, I'm just doing it on the bottom side. What I've noticed through observation is that a lot of times you just tend to get one little, it's almost like a lens flare effect where like you're just getting one little bit of a color on one side of things, and it looks very, very nice. So don't overdo it past the yellows even, and it looks really, really nice. So here I am edge highlighting just a little bit. You guys know that I like to edge highlight. The less the viewer know where the edge of the sword is, the less the viewer know that it's a hard edge, and I 100% recommend it. It's, for me, it's a somewhat artistic choice, but it's also a somewhat realistic choice. You can make your own decision about it, but if you're learning this, and you want to make it a little bit more effective, I would strongly recommend edge highlighting. The other thing that it does in this instance is that it reestablishes that the gray scale is kind of the dominant thing. And so, again, just something to consider. That is where we ended up with this advanced non-metallic metal tutorial. I hope that you guys enjoyed this extra little bit of information, this deep dive into how these things work, and in this case, how I painted the non-metallic metal for the Orc Ranger that was entered in a few competitions, did somewhat well this year. I really hope that you guys enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your support. Keep on the lookout for next month's tutorial. If you guys have any questions at all for me, please let me know. And if you try this technique out, I want you to tag me. I want you to let me know so I can take a look. You guys are awesome. Thanks for being the best crew around, and happy painting.